Welcome to the Kent Lap Podcast.
We start with race in the Bible, like I said, foundational, and I do it pretty quick. But and then one of the things I try to do is bust some of the myths. Okay, so and even some of the misinterpretations of the Bible. So like Genesis 9:27, the quote curse of Ham was used to justify the enslavement of dark-skinned peoples because Ham was the dark-skinned son of Noah. Well, the interesting thing about that is Ham wasn't cursed; it was Canaan, and curses didn't work like that. And they were, usually 3 or 4 generations, and it would certainly never involve sinning against people in order to, as a punishment for this curse, right?
Right.
And so, so things like that, even the idea of like interracial, you mentioned that earlier, interracial dating and marriage. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians called, that talks about unequally yoked, believers not being unequally yoked to unbelievers. Has nothing to do with races.
No one says that, do they?
It uses a metaphor of lightness and darkness. Okay, spiritual light, and that
some people use that as justification for
yes,
outlawing interracial marriage.
Used to be.
Holy cow!
And I'm sure there's still some who do. But it's I can remember, and even if generally speaking, if I ask my students, hey, are your parents, would they be cool if you dated somebody of a different race or married somebody of a different race? And let me be clear. People who are white and black would say, no, I've got family members who would not like that. Okay. Maybe it's a grandparent, maybe it's a mom or a sibling, but so there's still some of that obviously going. But once again, I want to look at it from the biblical perspective. Anyway, so we do that. Some other myths. So we do some African history, kind of before the transatlantic slave trade, because there's this notion, I think, with a lot of people that, Africa was just always this backwards country or continent, and they were, the kind of images of like Tarzan or something, and that's not true. There was thriving cultures who, in some cases, were way more advanced than civilizations in Europe. So when Europe was stuck in the Middle Ages, there's Alexandria in Egypt, there's Timbuktu, which is in Western Africa, which were these thriving centers of trade and education. There was huge universities and libraries, technological advancements, scientific advancements that are happening there when most of Europe is stuck in the Middle Ages. So we do some real basic. Most of the early church fathers, the leaders of the church, were African, including Augustine and Cyprian and Origen. Were all. In many ways, the church was an African church. For the first couple hundred years after Christ. And
so it's a safe bet that Saint Augustine was black.
Well, I think he was dark. He was probably darker skinned than you or I.
That's a pretty safe bet. Most people are, unfortunately.
So and going back to race in the Bible, there's a lot. I think there was a lot of our heroes of the faith that were dark skinned that we know this about, and so. Anyway, so then we look at, I do a little short history of slavery and different slave systems, including the Trans-Saharan slave trade, which was happening in Africa before European countries or European slave traders came into the continent and apprehended Africans and took them across the Atlantic Ocean for the purpose of sort of oppressing them into slavery. So we talk about how did that happen? Why did it happen when it did? What were the factors in Europe and West Africa and in, quote, the New World that made the transatlantic slave trade what it would become? There's really no good statistics, but most scholars believe there were between 15 and 50 million Africans that were taken. Now, many didn't even make it to the coast or the slave ships. Many died on the voyage itself. Most went to, South America, the Caribbean, and North America. Some went to India and parts of Asia. Some went to other parts of Africa. So we do a pretty big study of that. Then we get into sort of the colonial era in what will become America. How did slavery develop? What about free? Because there's always a free population of I can't call them African Americans, of black settlers or black people who were in the colonies. And then we get into obviously so what was happening with the Declaration of Independence. I mean, initially, this is a fun fact. Thomas Jefferson, who's principal author of the Declaration of Independence, also a slave holder, was very critical of slavery in the early drafts of the Declaration of Independence. And he's really kind of pointing his finger in the eye of King George, right? He's making it as if King George is the reason why slavery happened. And this was going to be part of the Declaration of Independence. If you go read it today, you'll see nothing about slavery. Why is that? Well, because Southern colonies, mainly South Carolina and Georgia, said, we're not signing that document if you're critical of slavery. So when you think about that John Hancock signature, all those signatures of the leaders, those delegates, I don't know the word for them, but at the Continental Congress were not willing to sign it because they were fearful that, hey, if we win this war, when it comes, because they knew it was going to come, we don't want slavery to end. Okay, so once again, you see compromise. So the Northern delegates were like, we got to all be together if we're going to beat the Brits, if we're going to beat the British. So they compromised it out of the Declaration of Independence. So there's nothing about slavery. So we talk about that in the Constitution, as I mentioned earlier, and we get into, obviously, the events that led up to the Civil War. Then we study Reconstruction, Jim Crow era, and I break that up. And in the middle of the Jim Crow era, I'll do a study on the history of jazz music. It's fun, it's unique, and in many ways, jazz music is very much connected to our history, to what was happening in the early Jim Crow period to right up through the Civil Rights Movement. So we kind of, and there's also a connection to like the Harlem Renaissance. And then we look at the Civil Rights Movement, and then I finished the year, which was a little truncated this year because of the coronavirus, but with what I just call it the post-Civil Rights Movement. So we go from, post Dr. King's assassination right up to the present day. And throughout the year, we will look at current event issues. Okay.
Oh, fascinating.
So we're talking about, some of the debates on the statues and, if they're like, whatever happens in the news. And one of my first assignments I do at the beginning of the year is I give them a real narrow focus. You can look from 4 different sources. Usually it's like the Tennessean, USA Today, New York Times, maybe Wall Street Journal, because I know they can get those too at Starbucks. You got a weekend, 3 days, bring in an article about race, only those 4 sources. And they're like, well, what if there's nothing? Okay, then you don't have to do it. And the point is, there's always multiple articles.
I was just going to say that. How do you? Well, I just pick a random weekend.
It's right at the beginning of school, so it's usually like the second class. And the point I want to make to them is our race matters now too. This is not just something we're studying the history, because I am taking a gamble. And I guess the point is if there's no issues, then maybe we can stop teaching the class. I don't know. Yeah, but there's always multiple articles that show up, even in just those few. So I guess my point is I always try to keep one foot in the present as we're studying our past. And so if something happens, like it happened in Georgia, I'm not going to act like it didn't happen. And while we're studying, whatever the Constitution, we're going to talk about it.
You're taking a real pragmatic approach to this thing. It's not just knowledge for the sake of head knowledge, but it's knowledge that can inform action today, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about the class is I typically, our school, I think we have about 18% people of color in our school. But usually a large number of African Americans will take the class.
I was going to ask about that.
So in some years I've had, about a 50-50 breakdown. Usually I have 2 sections. So I'll have a good number, a significant number of African Americans in the classroom. So we can have real dialogue and real conversation. And we talk about stuff like, real practical things like church and integration and friends. And when you go to college, fraternities, everything in our culture wants to separate and divide us. So even when they go to college, fraternities are segregated. The Christian organizations are often segregated, not necessarily intentionally, but that's how it plays out. And your roommates are the same race as you. And if you go to church, hopefully you do, you go to segregated churches, and then, the cycle just continues. And, and so we're talking about things like that.